There are numbers, there's literature that talks about the lack of affordable, adequate, and secure housing in well-located urban areas. When we started this paper, we really were focusing on affordable housing, and that's often how it gets framed. But it's more than just what's affordable. It's also what's adequate, what's secure, and there's a spatial element of where it's actually located. Estimates say that the global affordable housing gap is likely to increase by 1/3 in the next 10 years. We also, in terms of current adequacy, probably about, there are still 330 million households that don't have adequate housing. But we know also that estimates understate the problem both quantitatively and qualitatively. So, for example, how do you define sort of what is part of this affordable housing gap? Is it literally just having a roof over your house, over your head? Does it matter if that roof leaks when it rains? Does it matter if the wind might blow it away? Does it matter if city officials might come and kick you out of it and take over that space? All of those are different elements that sort of need to be addressed and often aren't. And in some of the numbers that I'll show on slums, we'll talk about this explicitly again. In addition, the thresholds for housing affordability often fail to take transportation costs into account. So folks may have a house, they move to a place that's more affordable because it's further out from the city, but then they have to spend money on getting to their job, getting to other kinds of services, getting to see there's friends and family. And while there's started to be a literature on housing plus transportation affordability, that still only looks at the monetary element, right? We know, though, that some of the most expensive in terms of social cohesion and families and thinking about the future is the amount of time that people spend moving from their house that's in the boonies into the city to where there are jobs and where there are services. So that's something that really doesn't get captured very well. And then we also know that women, children, and ethnic minorities are particularly affected by insufficient housing. And this has a cost right now in terms of their quality of life. But more than that, we have to think about what the costs are for the future. If kids don't have a place to study, if they're worried about getting kicked out, if they don't have a place to keep their books dry, they're going to be less efficient workers and less productive in the future, as well as having problems today. So when we look at some of the numbers, these are numbers that are provided by UN Habitat just on slums. Even using the term slum is very controversial, but UN Habitat uses that, and it's official, and the United Nations system in general does. So we use that, although in the paper we generally talk about informal settlements more than using the term slums. And what you can see here is that the proportion of urban slum population is a proportion of general populations, this is not quite right, has been coming down, right, in line with some of the goals that have been set by the United Nations. But the absolute number has been going up, and then you can see it broken down by different region here. There are almost 900 million people that live in these officially denominated slums, but it really depends on what the national government defines as a slum. So again, what you're talking about when you're addressing slum often is not just the house or the shelter itself, but the shelter plus some combination of services. So something may be labeled a slum if it has either a solid floor, or if it lacks a solid floor, a solid wall, or a solid roof. And it might just be one of those things that it's lacking, depending on what the government decides in terms of how it classifies these numbers. The same thing in terms of access to some of the services that go into providing sort of adequate housing. If you get 1 hour of electricity, that might be enough to label something, to not label it a slum, or not label it as inadequate, whereas many folks would say that that's not really adequate. So those are some of the numbers that we have. In terms of why we care about this, we care about this because of quality of life issues, as well as issues of inclusion and access to services and amenities for residents, including a sense of community and identity. This helps folks be better citizens as well as better workers. Decrease service infrastructure costs for cities and lower transportation costs for residents in terms of the individual cost sort of for the family on the latter part of that. And in the earlier, decreased service infrastructure cost affects public finance and what cities need in order to maintain, especially networked infrastructure for folks that are out there. In addition, well-located, secure, adequate, and affordable housing helps promote economic development and links to labor markets for residents. Here, I am an economist by training. As far as economists are concerned, this is why economists like cities, is in terms of labor markets. That's how they're often defined, often in a very limited way. We're trying to go beyond that here, but it still is a very, very important piece of what makes a city work and making sure that the different factors that create cities sort of can get to where they need to be productive. What we try to do in the paper is take a look at very sort of complicated overlapping markets. Right? When we talk about housing, we're not just talking about sort of four walls, a roof, and a floor. You're talking about the land itself, right? And those are very, very complicated markets, not transparent in many, many places of the world. You're talking about the buildings that are on them and the components of those buildings, right? If the concrete, the wood, the glass, the steel, all of those other things that might go into it, cardboard in some cases, right, depending on where you are. Finance, in terms of how folks access that service and how they're going to pay for it immediately over time, and then how that might change and transfer ownership down the line. Then there are the services that come into it that will be covered by other chapters in the World Resources Report, but that really are often bundled together as part of housing when people think about what adequate housing really is. Things like water, electricity, sewage. We also have issues of overlapping legal approaches, right? There's the formal law, then there may be more traditional approaches to law in ownership and use of homes, whether that is linked to it often is different across different ethnic groups. They're not consistent. And so these overlapping legal systems add another dimension of the challenge. This paper does not address what a lot of people come expecting in a paper on housing, which is especially from the economic side and the institutions that work on this, which is about housing finance. We talk about it a little bit as an enabler or an obstacle to how people access this service, but if you're looking for housing finance, there's lots of papers at the World Bank you can go read if you want. We don't talk so much about public or social housing, although we try to summarize some of the literature about it, because we don't see that that's worked all that well in places, and it's not something that a city alone can focus on. We try to find approaches to the challenges that we look at by seeing what cities could do themselves or in conjunction with other parts of government. And we don't really talk about the shift that happened in a lot of parts of the world of moving from state-led to market-led systems for housing that you see in Eastern Europe or in sort of the former Soviet Union and Russia right now. And so those sort of are set aside. But what we did try to do was to break down, and I'd say sort of our three big departures from the existing literature that's out there, is moving from the dichotomies to continuums in terms of public and private, sort of as one thing, right? It's not just private, it's not just public. Permanent and temporary, as well as formal and informal. We tried to look at things across a range of typologies. These are existing housing conditions going from street shelter, which is not something that you want to aspire to, but it's a reality in terms of the countries that we're looking at in the Global South, to informal settlements. And even within those informal settlements, there's some that have services, there's some that don't have services, there's some that are very consolidated, that looking at them, you wouldn't necessarily say, you know, this is technically an informal settlement, but that may not have all of the elements that you generally would need to move into a more formal economy. Classification like condominiums or co-ops, And there you can have sort of sharing of different kinds of pieces and shared ownership to then individual homes. And so we look at the characteristics of services in space in terms of quality, in terms of what's shared and what's individual, and then in terms of ownership, that you can have private ownership, you've got public ownership, there's a lot of social or collective ownership, there's indigenous ownership, there's contested ownership, right? Whether it's not clear because of the different system, if it's rural or urban, in some cases in peri-urban areas, and then rentals. We focus a lot on rentals in this paper, and that's an area that's also typically under, it doesn't get as much attention paid to sort of in a lot of the literature that's out there. And then looking at finance, and again, thinking about self-finance, subsidies, microloans, and vouchers or mortgages. Local context matters a lot, right? And so we don't really talk about solutions in this paper, we talk approaches. We talk about approaches that then can be localized depending on how a particular, not just city, but a specific area can actually address a lot of these issues together. So the three challenges that we focus on are the growth of underserviced, substandard housing that's often disconnected from livelihood possibilities. Second is the policy overemphasis on homeownership, and third, inappropriate land policies and regulations that push the poor out of the city to peripheral areas or even ex-urban areas. The first sort of challenge is how to deal with underserviced, substandard housing disconnected from livelihoods. And so in all of these cases, I'll talk about an approach that we think has been used successfully in a place and talk about an example. So we prefer and talk about how in situ upgrading typically works out better than relocation programs, except where there are location-based risks, right? One needs to be aware of those risks, of the possibilities of floods, of landslides. These location-based risks are actually increasing as a result of climate change. And so that needs to be an element of where people live and can remain living over time. Upgrading in a place that you know is going to get wiped out every year or even every 5 years is going to be different than a place that folks can really plan to stay for a long time. Upgrading programs typically finance services and amenities, as well as the shelter itself, and the security of occupancy rights. This is an area that sometimes is very controversial. Folks say that they want effective tenure, but what effective tenure actually is in different locations can be different. In some places, it might be a piece of paper. In a lot of places, a piece of paper might not be enough, right? If it's not enforced. In other places, it might not be the piece of paper at all. It might just be a promise that's credible that you won't get evicted, right? And we do talk about how the right of non-eviction actually is sort of a fundamental base that you can aim at before you work on all of the details of the tenure system. The programs that we've seen that are successful tend to be comprehensive and not just limited. They tend to be participatory, taking into account the knowledge and energy of the people that are working, so that live in that location, so that folks feel that this is a program that is being done with them, not sort of a program done on them, right? Or even for them necessarily. Another key element of success is something that's financially sustainable in terms of thinking about what is doable now, but what the folks that live in that community are going to be able to maintain over time. So an example of in situ upgrading is the Mong Kong program in Thailand. In 2003, the Thai government launched the Mong Kong upgrading program that helped upgrade informal settlements based on a collective ownership approach. And the program worked very well in Bangkok, and it was expanded throughout Thailand through CODI, the Community Organizations Development Institute, that helped connect communities with government subsidies and loans so that the community groups could then upgrade and figure out how they wanted to improve their communities together. They linked them with architects, they got them all working together. As of 2014, we had over 100,000 households that were helped throughout Thailand. While this has been quite successful in Thailand, the Asian Coalition on Housing Rights has been attempting to use this in other parts of Southeast Asia. It hasn't quite succeeded in the translation. And so some of that points to, I think, the importance of leaders and the very specific ties that we see in Thailand between the folks that were working from the community groups with people in the government and the way that those programs were structured. But it gives us an example of something that has worked. The next approach is overcoming the emphasis on home ownership. And we talk about developing rental housing for all different income markets or income levels and segments. This doesn't mean that we think that in this paper that housing ownership is bad. I mean, it's a fine thing, but the reality when we look at the numbers and increasingly over time is we see that rentals are very important, but that almost all of the government policies and government funds that are allocated to housing go to promote ownership instead of promoting, also being able to use for rentals. And so we talk about improving legal frameworks. Those legal frameworks might mean having an explicit rental policy that is supported by federal money as well as federal rules, making sure that the rights and responsibilities of both tenants and renters and owners and landlords are actually explicit and that everybody knows those up front, and getting rid of some of the other obstacles to rent that exist in certain kinds of places. Avoiding financial bias generally is about sort of the subsidies that often are hidden within the tax system, within other areas that provide, that bias sort of the housing decision towards ownership rather than rental, sort of on both sides of the market. And then to make this all work, ideally you want well-structured subsidies, but you also want flexibility that reflects the way that the potential renters or the potential tenants of any type get their income. If they get their income in lump sums, if it's very seasonal, you want to make sure that that you can allow for payments that match sort of that seasonality in terms of the way that money comes in, and not necessarily sort of say it's going to be the same amount sort of every single month. An additional barrier in this area often that is I'd say that hits all three of those are the kinds of large deposits that are often required, right? Whether it's 10 months of rent in advance that are required as a deposit in a place like Bangalore to 3 years in a place like Lagos, right? And so that's something that needs to be taken into account. An example of rentals, and this is a little bit controversial, is backyard rentals in South Africa, in Gauteng province, which is around Johannesburg, that legalized something that people were doing on their own, which was renting out part of their backyard and either building sort of huts or letting folks build their own huts in the backyards. It was illegal for many, many years. Sometimes the government would come in and sort of move people out. Sometimes a new owner of a house would decide they didn't want those folks and move them out. So finally, they recognized their inability, fairly recently in 2015, that sort of the formal market was not meeting the housing demand that was there. So they legalized and encouraged backyard rentals. This can work. But for this to work, it means that a lot of that trunk infrastructure that's provided needs to be increased to support that increased density, as well as sort of the social attitudes about the kinds of people that live in those kinds of houses, where their kids can go to school. All of those kinds of things need to be sort of incorporated into the system. And if you just allow this without thinking of those other pieces, you're probably going to stir up a lot of problems and resentment and not have a successful housing policy. The third challenge that we focused on was really the underutilization of urban land. Instead of pushing the poor out, we talk about how you might incentivize using some of that land for affordable housing. So this includes things like realistic regulations and standards. That can be on the zoning side. It can also be on the building side. You need to allow for incremental housing improvements in construction to reflect the reality of how lots of folks that are facing challenges in the housing market adapt and are able to finance sort of building construction. You also have to allow for possibilities of community ownership, that if you're only thinking about individual ownership, you're going to lose a lot of the opportunity to diversify some of the risk and structure things in a way that will be more sustainable over time. When we talk about realistic regulations and standards, they can be things like parking requirements, right? If you're sort of building a new apartment or any kind of housing dwelling, to say that you have to have at least one parking space for one car. For folks that don't have cars, that just adds costs. In some places, it might be a requirement for 3 cars in places in Brazil. On the standard side, you need to make sure that you're maintaining basic health and safety standards, but while we want to promote efficient construction and housing, and we can all aspire to triple paned windows. Triple paned windows, probably, if you have in some of the places that you're talking about, just talking about making sure that there's a screen on a window might be much more effective in a rule that actually can be implemented and enforced, more than aiming for something that's much more expensive and much more sort of long-term and aspirational. And in this case, we actually talk about an example in Namibia, in Windhoek, that has different levels of construction for different segments of the market, that I thought was sort of a very interesting and flexible way to introduce standards so that you're not designing for the high end of the market and then pricing everybody else out and forcing them all into the informal sector, which often happens. This also then, you want straightforward and easy to understand processes and zoning rules, right? You don't want the process of building to be so complicated and non-transparent that you need to get lawyers and special consultants to help you through the system. And that if you don't, then you're condemned sort of to informality and sort of always the chance that the government is going to say, oh, you didn't do something right, therefore we can sort of wipe you out. You also need to think about tax policy and taxing underutilized land and underutilized buildings, and then providing incentives for production and conversion to affordable housing is one of the things that we talk about in the paper. One of the examples of incremental housing is here in Quinta Monroy in Iquique in Chile, and the Chile Barrio program that had an incremental housing approach. So you had the physical foundations of each house with the floors, with the walls, the floors, the kitchen, and the bathroom were constructed, while the rest was left unfinished. And then families were allowed to incrementally develop and expand the rest of the house. So here, where you can see the difference, for example, in the space here that's blue, that's painted, that was built, and then the unpainted part that was built incrementally after the original sort of plot. The details are in the paper about how much this cost. The architect actually won a big prize. The blueprints now are available sort of in an open source kind of way to encourage other folks to try to use this in other parts of the world. But it means that you've got to allow for incremental housing to be built. And incremental housing often is done in a way that inherently sort of leads to non-safe, dangerous, non-healthy construction, and so finding the right balance for that is often is quite hard. So another example is thinking about community ownership and community land trusts. What community land trusts do is buy the land, which is often the most expensive part of housing, right, in terms of having that land, and then keep the ownership of the land. In this case, this is actually not in the center of the city. This is in the peri-urban area in Cochabamba in Bolivia. Maria Auxiliadora is a community that's run by women. It was established in 1999. The families, when they want to leave, or if they get kicked out, which happens in some cases, the land can't be sold for a profit, but needs to be sold back to the organization that then maintains it, so that the profits go up. The profits aren't allowed to go to the family, and the community land trust manages that all. It helped move collective land ownership, what is allowed under the Bolivian Constitution for rural areas, but it was never allowed for urban areas. And so it allowed this idea of collective land ownership in cities too, which was a pretty dramatic change. And then it's got a unique governance structure that's very female-focused, and it ejects men that they think aren't behaving the right way towards their families or towards women. So the paper talks about these challenges, it talks about these approaches, and it really says that we need to think about the existing housing conditions and possibilities in this spectrum. When we think about these three approaches, that they often are combined. So when we're talking about in situ, participatory, and formal settlement, we often need to think about how to use underutilized land to do that. We often need to think about how it can be used for rental as well as ownership. But I hope that you are at least a little bit interested so that you want to read the whole paper, which really is quite short now compared to earlier versions of it. This is an area that we haven't done all that much work in, sort of in the WRI Center, or in the Ross Center, but that we've got pieces of it in a lot of the work that we do. So the question was about what financial sustainability means in sort of the context of upgrading programs. I mean, some of it is about what the sort of, oftentimes the programs themselves, whether they come from money from sort of an outside institution, is focused on the initial upgrading, but doesn't really pay attention to the ongoing maintenance costs that are required. Right? It's sort of very similar to a lot of what we see in terms of the way that transportation projects are financed. Right? There's lots of capital costs, that money's set up, you've got this great system, but that you don't think about how it's going to be maintained and operated. And it's sort of similar kinds of things. And so we see that, for example, even in, I mean, not just the global south, also in the global north, in terms of housing that's provided for sort of at different income levels, that folks that move into that then, even if they're able and get some kind of help for that initial upfront cost, don't have access to funding to make sure that they've got the money to pay for the upkeep and the maintenance and the services that they need to